The world, you could argue, is being swept with anti-establishment nationalists gaining notoriety for what they perceive to be the national core of their modern state. You will recognise Donald Trump rising to the position of President-elect in the United States of America, saying, "Let's make America great again." Nigel Farage promoting the principle of British greatness and the opportunities that lie outside of union with the European Union. Geert Wilders, a Dutch politician. Down here, Norbert Hofer, recently lost by a close margin the presidential election in Austria, a far-right nationalist. Marine Le Pen, from the Front National in France, probably in for a pretty good shot at becoming the next French president. And given what's happened already this year, this 2016, who knows what 2017 will throw up. If she does become president of France, I would propose that that's a massive, massive move. The final individual there is Frank Petry of the Alternative Germany platform, which is a nationalist movement within Germany that is beginning to take shape in opposition to the government of Angela Merkel. I would propose then that far from nationalism having died with the divisive politics of World War II, we're actually seeing a resurgence of nationalism as a concept and nationalism as something around which our political systems are increasingly developing. So, brings us on to the topic of today's talk, which is nationalism as a form of identity. Who do you think you are? We're going to address a few issues. We talk about nationalism. We need to consider, actually, what do we mean by the term nation? We need to think about how our definition of nation, and therefore our identity that comes as a consequence of it, how that impacts upon society. And I want to think, finally, about the impact that nationalism plays today for us as individuals. So, we're a small group. How would you define the term nation? What?
So perhaps a group of people in a country, you could say, so England is a nation, and then you could perhaps include Ireland.
Okay, so it's a group of people.
Exactly.
Okay, Laurie.
A group of people that think they are the same as the other people of a similar type.
So could it be that because you presumably consider yourself to be female, a nation could be of like-minded females? Is that a nation? You think of yourself as being similar to the person that could. Any other thoughts off the back of that? So we've got the idea of a people and a country, and we've got the idea of sort of some element of commonality. Any other ideas? Here's some thoughts. Do we think of nation as being about sharing some kind of heritage? Perhaps a cultural connection? Perhaps a language connection? Are we English because we speak English? Is it about a shared ancestry? Is it about tracing back and seeing where we originate? It's about values. We'll come back to values. Values are important. As a teacher, it is incumbent upon me, as it is upon all teachers in the British education system, to promote British values. Come back to that. Is it about geography? So that's your point, really, which is this principle of actually maybe a nation is about territory. quite a difficult one there. Here's a challenging. Is it about race? Is nationhood, is national identity about the race or the shared race of the people within that group? Or indeed, is it about religion? It's a difficult one to define. Anthony Appiah, who delivered the Reith Lectures for the BBC this year, came up with this definition. He said, it is a people, and even there you've got to then define what a people is. A people who think of themselves as sharing ancestry and caring about it. Now, this is difficult. As a Cornishman, I have more in common with the Celts of Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, indeed Wales, than I do in the Anglo-Saxon English. But the Celts have no interest in sharing that common heritage, and consequently, we do not form a nation. So there are issues even with this idea of sharing ancestry. So Appiah's point about caring about it enough to form a nation is really very important. Now, it is really important to think of nations as being essentially fluid, and also to reflect upon the reality that they are constructed. They are constructed by people who want to use them, I would suggest, or use the concept as a means to expand and develop their personal and political, often, agenda. Benedict Anderson refers to a nation as being an imagined political community. Imagined in the sense that there's nothing physical, often, that separates a nation from another. If you travel, for example, within Europe, between the nation states of France and Belgium, do you notice that you have crossed that border? In reality, they are imagined. It is not a physical distinction. Gellner makes the point that nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness, but rather it is the invention of nations when they do not exist. There is no intrinsic bond, I'd suggest, that can be said to tie one people to another. There is no sort of innate reason to think of yourself as being more aligned with one group than another group. The idea of invention is something that Renan then develops. And I want to really focus on this because this is really important, and from a historian's perspective, it's fascinating. Inventing, he said, is forgetting, and I would even say historical error, is an essential element in the creation of a nation. So, forgetting, and I would even say historical error, is an essential element in the creation of a nation. Now, I told you earlier that part of my professional responsibility as a teacher is to promote British values. Part of our professional responsibility as a school is to promote British values. This was something that was really developed as a consequence of the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, and various others. But it is incumbent upon us to try and promote Britishness. Now, I wonder what that means. So a lot of people talk about Britishness as meaning a belief in fair play, a want to promote freedom, tolerance, inclusiveness. openness, freedom of speech. And we look to history to provide the evidence of that happening. And history shows us that a huge number of things do support that view. Britain, the country that abolished the slave trade. Britain, the country that brought education, that brought health to its empire. But it's conveniently forgotten, of course, and indeed often not taught in British schools, that this same Britain created concentration camps in order to starve the women and children of the Afrikaner republics out of the conflict in the early 1900s. 25,000 people killed in those concentration camps by those fair-minded British people that are part of our heritage. We don't focus, it has to be said, in schools very much on the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where essentially it could be argued that the British colonial authorities perpetrated a form of genocide against the Kikuyu. Again, thousands exterminated in the pursuit of British supremacy. It's interesting, teaching the French Revolution and talking to French teachers about the way in which the French Revolution is taught in French schools. The French Revolution was a great uprising against the monarchy in France, against the system, indeed, the political system within France. It was about equality, it was about equality, it was about fraternity. And that is what they learn in French schools. They don't then learn about the terror, which went afterwards, where the French people essentially fought tooth and nail against one another for supremacy in the post-monarchical era. So we choose what history we want to promote our nation upon. We select, we invent. Not necessarily because we make it up, but because we select, we choose. In order to just kind of illustrate really what I think, again, emphasizes that the reality that nations are quite fluid. I just want to show you some maps. This is Africa in 1914. You have 4 independent nations within Africa: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. The others batched really into groups that are led, dominated by a colonial power. Have a look at the world, the map of Africa today. 54 separate nations within Africa. So we've gone from a point in 1914, and indeed we could project that forward to even up to the 1950s, it has to be said, through to the current time, 1950s, Africa essentially dominated by European powers, through to the current day, where there are these created nations. And they are created to such a point where if you look at the border, say, between Libya and Egypt, it's straight, drawn with a ruler. That is what has created this nation. Think about Europe. Not very clear, perhaps, but this is Europe in the 1800s, after the Napoleonic Wars. You can see some semblance of what we would currently call nations. So you can see that there is a France, there's a Spain, there's a Britain. But there's no Germany in the modern sense. There are lots of states that we would now call, where we would now refer to Germany. There's Hungary, a huge portion there. There's the Commonwealth of Poland. And we look at the map today. We have the creation of nations. Consequence of World War I, and then even through World War II, nation states emerging. If we think about the Volk that Bismarck promoted when he united the German states into a German nation, if you like. If we think about the Volk that then Hitler promotes when he comes to power, or indeed in the period running up to power when he's trying to unite the German people, it came into existence in 1870 as a consequence of the Franco-Prussian War. The nation that he was celebrating, the national identity he was promoting, was entirely new. Now, if we think about, before we move on to this next slide, if we think about for a moment this concept of nationhood, I would argue that it's really a consequence of what we could term the Romantic period. So it's kind of like a kickback to a period of time in the 1700s where the Enlightenment was the prevailing view. In other words, we have this period of rational thought, scientific discovery, where all the sort of old systems and old ideas are being challenged. And against that, there is this sort of romantic desire to create a past which is more based in folklore and common heritage. So you have people like Robert Burns and others who essentially try and draw people together into these nation states. If you take the national anthem, British national anthem, which you kind of figure is quite an important part of our national identity, difficult to know precisely when it was when it was adopted in that form, but probably not until around about the 1850s. And it wasn't actually sung at a coronation, a crowning of the monarch, until the death of Queen Victoria. So the national anthem of Great Britain is a new invention. The kilt, such an important part of Scottish cultural tradition, is something which emerges during the 1600s. Britain, as a concept, emerges during the 1700s as a consequence of the Act of Union, and even then it isn't really cemented until much later. So nationalism is, as I say, something that is a product. It's something of an invention. If we think about nationalism today, and we think about the campaign to exit, or indeed remain, within the European Union. I can't stand the word Brexit, by the way, so I'm going to call exit from the European Union. The message is all about national sovereignty. It's all about taking, here we are, look, taking power back. Brexit will mean the right of the people of Britain to settle their own destiny, said Boris Johnson. And that was echoed by the likes of Michael Gove, by Nigel Farage and others. It's all about taking back control. Britain and Britons, collectively, having the right to say what they want and how they want to do it. But of course there is a massive problem there, because within the nation of Great Britain, there are sub-nations, if you like. The nation of Scotland narrowly rejected independence last year, voted overwhelmingly to remain within the European Union. So the question is, actually, who wins there? Who's actually got the right to settle their own destiny? Britain or England? Where do you draw the line between those two groups? How do you construct your nation? Lines of immigrants, the implied message here, waiting, just waiting to come into Britain and to dilute the British national spirit and put pressure on the British institutions. Donald Trump peering out over the top of his wall there. A massive appeal of Donald Trump is his message on immigration and his desire to prevent Mexicans, particularly, from entering the United States illegally. Build it all. I would argue, actually, nationalism rather than being about romantic ideals of what we are together, creating a common heritage, I'd say nationalism today is actually much more about uniting against the other. It's much more about who we aren't than it is about who we are. Much more based, I think, on fear, on suspicion. And I think it indicates that perhaps the romantic era that we once had is gone. About this, one of the figures I showed you at the beginning was a man called Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell delivered a speech in the 1960s, a very powerful speech, very well-known speech, in which he predicted that the streets of Britain would flow with rivers of blood as a consequence of the immigration that was beginning to occur from, in this instance, a wave of immigration during the 1960s. Those people who were opposed at that point would now consider themselves to be English. The children of first-generation immigrants would now consider themselves to be English. Indeed, the immigrants themselves would consider themselves to be English or British. So, the way in which we define ourselves and the way in which we define nations changes pretty much as we want it to change. One day, it's in opposition to, say, the Polish immigrant population. The next day, maybe the perceived threat, comes from somewhere else. There was a famous politician, Norman Tebbit, who once tried to define Britishness. He talked about the cricket test. He said, well, if England are playing cricket, let's say they're playing India, who would you support? If you support England, then you are English. If your answer to that question is India, then you are not English. That is part of our national identity, apparently. Think about that. Renard, again, says this. He says that what matters, really, in making a nation is the expressed desire of the people to continue a common life. He talks about there being a continuous plebiscite. In other words, a continuous reflection on the extent to which we want to remain associated and allied with the people in our nation. I don't have any answers. This doesn't really have an end. The point is, I guess, for you to think carefully about what it is or how it is you define yourselves and what messages you allow our political leaders to impose upon us in pursuit of their power. Nationalism, I would argue, has been abused over time. Thank you very much for listening. A nation means different things for different people. So, for example, I asked my wife last night. She is the daughter of an immigrant family. So her parents came from Sri Lanka in the 1980s, 1970s. I said, how would you identify yourself? And she said, well, I consider myself to be British. And I said, well, why British? I don't know, I just think that's what I would say. I said, well, would you not associate yourself with being English? No, not English. Because to be English, she said, is to be white. Now, in my view, perhaps it's an interesting definition, but it's obviously based upon the prejudices perhaps that she's faced through her life in terms of the way people have perceived her. I haven't had that, so my perception of what it is to be in a nation is going to be slightly different. And you know, you all have different experiences of life, and your parents have different experiences, and therefore it's likely that your definitions will all be very different. I think the key is to recognise that whatever it is that we identify as being a nation, we need to recognise that it is a construct. that it is something which is not set in stone. I think when you start thinking of things as being set in stone, then it becomes dangerous. Any other questions? Go on.
In your opinion, as a history teacher, would you say that nationalism has been more used for the power of good or the power of evil?
That's an interesting question. I would argue, actually, very much more for the power of evil. Because when you think about it, the power of good is about commonality. It's about being together. It's about recognizing the intrinsic value that is shared by humankind. As soon as you start to impose national, again, this is my view, I'm not suggesting this is what you need to think, but as soon as you start imposing national boundaries and you kind of put blocks up against other people, then you are immediately creating that sort of in-group, out-group mentality, which creates problems. So that would be my personal view. Yeah?
In your opinion, who's the best nationalist leader?
Well, again, it depends entirely upon your definition of nationalism. So in theory, any leader who is effective in promoting their nation is a great leader. That doesn't necessarily mean that they approach it from a sort of a nationalist agenda. So it's not like they would necessarily consider it to be an exclusive agenda, but simply as an agenda that's pursued for the benefit of the people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it probably just depends upon, again, your definition of the term.